Hi everyone, I am Clare O'Dowd. I'm research curator at the Henry Moore Institute, and I've recently curated the portable sculpture exhibition that's due to open at some point in 2021. I'm joined now by Claire Ashley, who is one of our participating artists and who has made a new work, Clown, for the portable sculpture exhibition. Claire was born in Scotland and received her BA from Gray's School of Art in Aberdeen, and is now resident in Chicago, where she received her MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And Claire now teaches there in the Department of Contemporary Practices and also the Department of Painting and Drawing. And we're really pleased to be able to talk to Claire about her practice more generally and about the new work that she's made for the exhibition. So Claire, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for inviting me to participate in this fantastic show. I'm super excited.
I am excited too, really excited, especially about the new work that we are going to be showing that you've made for us.
I know, it just was picked up yesterday, so it's gone. It's in the air now.
It is being ported as we speak. Quite an unusual work within the scope of the exhibition, because it is an inflatable. And you've now been working in this way, producing inflatables for quite some time. So could you tell us a bit about how you arrived at this way of working?
Yes, it's sort of a long pathway. I've been working with inflatables now for over about 13 years. And I came to it from about 3 different kind of positions, I guess. One was watching my kids grow up and realizing that I was interested in trying to capture their energy and liveliness and sort of reference bounce houses and toys, but also sort of living, breathing beings of some kind. The second was a solution. I taught an inflatables class or exercise with a colleague of mine a number of years ago, and realized that it would be a pretty sort of practical solution for me in terms of having a very small studio space to be able to create a monumental sculptural work or a monumental painting, but that it could pack down and fit in a very small space. It also became very important because it was a more flexible, portable, literally form of working that allowed me to sort of maintain my sort of feisty independence that I am really wedded to and connected to. I usually will work by myself. I don't really have very many studio assistants. On larger projects, I will have 1 or 2, but I like that the portable sculptural form and the inflatable allows me to be to maneuver these very monumental objects in a very easy way. So it was sort of those 3 prongs of thinking. Eventually I came to realize that I could use also the skin of the inflatable that was a very thin membrane to be like a canvas, right? To be a surface on which to paint I unfortunately use evil spray paint, so it's not very environmentally friendly. So that is one problem of my work, but I do really like that it references graffiti, and so it has a kind of a reference point out in the world that people can access. I also love that it references tattooed skin. So there's a way that it has a particular kind of energy or characteristic that gets embedded into the forms that I make. And even though when I started making work 30 years ago, I keep saying 20 years, but it's actually 30 years ago now, that I never thought I would make figurative sculpture, but here I am making these forms that in some uncanny way reference, have figural aspects to them, sort of either an appendage, a limb, an eyeball, in some way have a sort of a cartoonish or a comedic or a kind of abstract figural reference to them that is hopefully pretty absurd.
There is a lot of humour in them. I find them kind of uncanny and disturbing a little bit, but mostly really funny. And I think there is such a need and a place for that in contemporary art. It needs some humour. Right.
Well, that's certainly the way that I think about humour, as a sort of, it's a really important tool to be able to understand the world, or to be able to cope. You know, it's a really important coping mechanism. And certainly coming from Scotland, humour is embedded in my DNA, and sort of the Billy Connolly physical comedy, Benny Hill physical comedy that I grew up on has stuck with me. It's really sort of ingrained in the way that I take myself very seriously, and I can't take myself too seriously at the same time. And the physical sort of qualities of the object hopefully are comedic, but then also I do use the color palette of the object very particularly as an in-your-face, aggressive action on the work, so that I want to attract people, but I also want to warn people. So color is sort of, I think of it as a genetic coding for survival that humans have, that they have to stop and pause and pay attention to color, because they know that it's either to warn them of a predator coming to get them, or it's something about reproduction. So I like that the color gets to be a very active, vocal system of warning in the way that I use it in the work.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Can we talk more, because you mentioned your training as a painter,
yes,
and the fact that these are like canvases for you. So can we talk a bit about the relationship between painting and sculpture?
Yes.
Because it's one of the boundaries. There are many boundaries and categories that become blurred in your work, I think.
Yes.
But that's kind of the most striking one.
Right.
There's a real relationship between the two that seems crucial to the way that the work is produced and the way that you've arrived at this particular mode of expression.
Yes, thank you for noticing that. Yes, I like that the form of the physical shape of the object. I often talk about it in terms of, if I'm not really enamored of the form of the sculptural object that I end up making, I know that the quality of the paint and the kind of visual energy that comes through the process of the painting, the color, the marks that are made, the kind of the activity that's happening on the surface, I get to then push and pull. I get to think perceptually about pulling elements of the form forward or pushing elements of the form back in space, just by the kind of activity of the color and the marks and the kind of language that is sort of embedded through the taping and the kind of particular kind of reference points that sometimes feel like it's like a pirate map, like it's X marks the spot, or it's a G spot kind of set of references on the body of the object. It's sort of a kind of system of mapping that happens over the entire body of the work, that allows both the sculptural object and the painting as a skin, or the painting as a as its own form of mapping or landscape to kind of embed together so that they're neither one or the other, right? I think that's why painters often think I'm not a painter and sculptors often think I'm not a sculptor, because I'm trying to really deliberately ride the line between both of those things, that they don't read necessarily primarily as one or the other, but that I am super invested in abstract painting, and I am super invested in figural sculptural and abstract sculptural object as well. And those two things, I think I always, even when I was first starting out as a painter, I was always thinking about painting in a very physical way, in a very visceral way. So I was never really interested in painting as narrative. I was also always interested in a painting being used to embody something. And that has definitely stuck with me in the way that I think of painted mark and color and texture and surface and translucency, right? And layers of depth of illusion that painting can get at as operating as a way to embody a kind of a personality or a character or a kind of quality in the sculptural form of the object. Often people say that it looks like it's printed, photographically printed, and it's because there's so many layers of the spray paint operating to pick up both the textures of the surface of the material when it's laid flat on the studio floor. So all the folds and the sort of wrinkles, for want of a better word, of the material get picked up in the painting surface that then becomes super taut when it's inflated. Yeah,
it seems like there's a lot of it's a very physical process.
It is a very physical process.
A lot of physicality in the painting, in the
right. I mean, the sewing is a pain in the butt. You know, it's a very in the largest pieces, I often have to sit on the concrete studio floor to sew it with so I use a sewing machine that isn't sort of an industrial level machine. It's a sort of a commercial machine. It's also portable. Like it needs to be able to move around the studio space with me. It can't be in one spot. Yes, the whole process is it's hard work. It's hard work. It's taxing.
Mm-hmm. And you kind of inhabit the process as well.
Right. Yes, and that's a good word. Yes.
You're kind of inhabiting the physicality of the painting and putting the thing together, and sometimes you or other people are inhabiting the sculptures as well at the end of this, aren't they?
Yes, exactly. So that's another piece of the puzzle in terms of I like the word inhabiting. The painting process is a sort of, I'm building in a very fast way. The painting activity itself, I have to do multiple passes of paint where I'm sometimes I'm painting in my back garden and making my husband nuts because he has a beautiful flower garden. But I'm painting and turning the fan off and on. So it's picking up different folds of the material. I'm also taping sections to stencil things. I'm getting up and down ladders. I'm like bending over and I'm wearing all this gear because it's evil spray paint. So that part of the process is very much about sort of a dynamic, hopefully, activity where the sort of the personality that's embedded in the surface of the object is a very kind of fast, imperfect process in some sense, that this thing comes alive before my very eyes, and I don't always know what it's going to look like until it actually inflates at the end. Similar to the sewing process. Like I've built over the last 10 years internal knowledge about what these things are going to look like when they are inflated, but I'm also not trained as a pattern cutter or maker. So there's always a little bit of accidental or kind of reveal in terms of the first time it gets inflated. Some of the seams will pop. And so the patching part of it is also another part of its how the piece sort of lives a life, and the imperfections of the surface actually are a really important part of its characteristics, right? It's not the perfect glossy Takahashi Murakami kind of a finish of work. It's actually, it looks graphic in images, but it's pretty rough when you actually see it in person. And I really like that sense of it living its life, or it having gone through the ringer, is part of the way it evolves. And then the other piece that you asked about in terms of inhabiting the sculptural objects of the paintings as part of their existence is that I will often add openings. I kind of call them udders. And I think of them often as sort of entry points for performers then to make the sculptures even more kinetic, or even more alive in the world, or even more physical comedy-like, right? I'm hoping that everybody laughs their asses off when they see these things, that especially the 12-person Ruddy Udder dance piece, that it's lumbering across a field out in the world, but it's just a 5-minute dance, right? It's a very short period of time that you get to view the pieces often as sort of animated in that way. But I like that again, it's sort of part of their life, right? They can have alter egos. I like that they can be completely outrageous in one instance and then sort of hold still in another instance, or be entirely at the end of their lives and deflated in another instance. So that sort of like constantly active kineticism is sort of the energy that I think constantly keeps me interested in working with this form, right? I still feel like I have work to do.
One of the things of yours that I've seen that cheered me up possibly most of all during the first lockdown was those the footage you showed me of your daughters wearing the inflatable.
Yeah.
Which is one of my favorite things to emerge out of lockdown. With your kids running around in these huge suits. They are wonderful.
So funny. I know, so funny. I know my poor children, I tortured them by making them do a TV slot. It was a total tongue-in-cheek idea of making these protection suits for them, but they were very good sports about being willing to.
They certainly were, but wonderful stuff. But again, it was the work being inhabited and kinetic and moving around. But
I know. Well, that's the first time, sort of not the first time, but that's a more recent move where I have there's more of the body that is visible when wearing the forms. The previous performance garments or body extensions that I've built have the only thing that you see are the legs of the performer sticking out the bottom. But these pieces, the last couple of pieces I've made have been more like, I wouldn't call them fashion garments, but they have referenced more of, they have allowed more of the body to be revealed. So the face, the hands, the feet. In these pieces, I had made one piece previously for a colleague of mine who wanted to do a show where it referenced a runway fashion kind of show, but was art objects. So I had made him a particular garment to wear, where his head and hands were sticking out, but it was this sort of giant blob. The COVID suits sort of came from that form of thinking where I was willing to reveal more of the human body. And I mean, I certainly took advantage of the terribleness of the situation of COVID, but I do feel like the humor of that solution is, again, I mentioned this earlier, like that humor is that sort of coping mechanism.
Yeah.
So I like that it was a bit of light relief in this sort of very dark moment.
Yes, it absolutely was. Much appreciated.
Yeah.
Can we talk about family? Because this is a crucial aspect to your work. and parenthood.
Right.
And it's something that rarely gets talked about.
Indeed, it does not. Yes.
Discuss.
I know, discuss. Well, I mean, that is part of my my super sort of feminist undercurrent in the work. I try not to wear, well, I think I'm doing this. I'm not sure if I'm actually doing this, but I try not to wear my feminist drive on the surface of the work. But it is very much embedded in the way that I talk about my work in relationship to the idea of an artist still being taken seriously and yet also having a family, and having this sort of sense that I am very critical of the art world in terms of, I mean, I'm a big Guerrilla Girls fan, and I'm very critical of the art world in terms of being dismissed because you are a woman and being dismissed because you are a woman who has had children. I think the next generation of artists is taking this on in a much better way than I have done, and in a much more direct and kind of aggressive way than aggressive in a good way, I mean, way than I have done perhaps. But I certainly, I will never negate or not talk about that part of it really is the reason I came to inflatable sculpture as a solution for making work, was freaking out about having kids of my own, and then slowly over the course of 10 years realizing that I could utilize that as a really important piece of the liveness of the work. The feminism piece is also built into obviously the scale of the work that's super obnoxious, and it's sort of built to take up as much space as possible as a female artist in the world, and to try and compete with the monumental sculptors who are working with super heavy steel, Richard Serra being the primary person in that goal. So I wanted to think about public sculpture scale, but to not work at public sculpture weight, right? Or permanence or seriousness, right? I wanted to sort of pull in and a feminist lens too, right? That I get to sort of make fun of the history of monumental sculpture and abstract painting, as much as I'm in love with it.
Masculine worlds, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. So I think both of those things are sort of places where feminism connects to the kind of the way that I talk about the work and the outcome that happens in terms of its flexibility of the work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. I think one of the things that really struck me when I thought about including your work in the exhibition was this idea that it came from this place of the influence of family, of having to deal with being a parent, with having limited space and limited time, and all these ideas about children's toys, about airbags and safety.
Yes.
That suddenly come to bear on the work, but also just the simple, very practical concern of not having much time or space to work. It sounds so kind of mundane, but the solution is just wild. And
I know.
That is just really kind of a completely different way of working.
Right. Thank you. Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think, you read the history books of all these, famous male artists who are saying, oh, I'm in the studio every day. I have to make something every day. And I'm like, that is not the reality of an artist situation where you are negotiating family and teaching and doing the laundry and making the dinner and driving. Right now I have early 20 somethings and late teenagers. So I'm no longer at the stage of having such an intense caretaking relationship to them, which is great in so many ways. But the parenting thing is never done, but it's such an important addition. I think the problems that one has to solve to get to make the work because of those constraints or limitations, I don't feel of them as necessarily negatives. I actually think I'm super lucky to have gone through the process, because I would never have gotten to the work I make right now without that experience and without that particular set of problems to solve. And I try and talk to young artists in my teaching about the fact that each of us are trying to find a solution to the art equation that needs to allow the quirks of one's life in, rather than feeling like you have to push all that out. You actually you have to do the opposite. You have to pay attention to that particular set of experiences and that particular set of interests, and pull that shit into your work in a way that makes it different to everybody else's, right? And I think that's something that I learned early on in terms of my experience of going through an education system, is that my teachers were talking to me about more generic kind of modes of what art should be, rather than really listening to what I was interested in. And so I've tried to flip that switch in my own teaching to kind of pay attention to each artist's kind of quirks, as it were, and to try and help them find ways to pull that into their work.
Absolutely.
If
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
Mm-hmm.
What were your influences?
Yeah, that's a good point. I was, even in Scotland, I was looking at, well, of course, I started with Rauschenberg and Elizabeth Murray, but then I was looking at Niki de Saint-Phal, Lee Bontecu, Linda Benglis, and more recently, Katarina Gross, Annabette Bez, so many good people, Alexis Teplin in terms of contemporaries. Yeah, but there's so many interesting ways that artists, I'm looking at artists who are really thinking about cross-pollinating in their work, and not primarily purely in sculpture realm or a painting realm, but places where they're crossing.
Yeah, and along with performance as well.
Right, exactly.
Performance coming out of that quite strongly.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, and Donna Huanca's work, very big influence in terms of a contemporary painter, sculptor, performer, who's using not her body, but other bodies to sort of enter the landscape of her installation work and kind of interrupt it, but in a very meditative, slow way. Her work is really beautiful. So, yeah, but mostly women, I have to say. I try and sort of reset the lens in terms of the artists of color, female artists who I'm recommending to students a lot of the time in terms of expanding a kind of a rewrite of history a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about sort of precedents for what you do, and
right,
and all the names I was coming up with were men.
right. Well, Niki de Saint-Phal is a big one. Yeah, Oldenburg, right? Exactly.
Yeah. Like,
yeah, I mean, definitely. When I found Niki de Saint-Phal, that was a big opener, right? Linda Benglis, big opener. Lee Bontecu, big opener. Because yes, the Klaus Oldenburg, the Paul McCarthy inflatables obviously are a big reference point that people talk about. Yeah.
It's good to have some women on those lists. Definitely.
Yeah, exactly.
So what about the kind of the future of inflatables? Because I'm seeing it wasn't so much a thing a few years ago.
I know it's
more and more people getting on board with this. And
I know. No, it's exciting. But the thing that I'm happy about so far is that a lot of the inflatable shows that are happening so far are still sort of purely in the sculpture or design realm of solutions with inflatables. There aren't many of us who are using it as a surface to paint on. There is an artist who's working with air balloons in Australia who makes these incredible, I'm blanking on her name right now, but who makes these incredible objects, but as hot air balloons. So there's a lot more conversation about inflatables in the last 5 years, which is terrific. But so far nobody has sort of really taken on the painting realm of it. And I would love to have somebody better what I do. I would love to have that happen.
And so I'm seeing a lot of artists who are kind of augmenting their own sculptural practice, and working with inflatables within
a larger practice, right?
But
yes,
I still haven't met anybody else who does just inflatables like you do.
Right. I know it's
really
hard,
right? And run with
it. Right. I know there are a lot of artists who will do sort of one-off inflatable pieces as part of their larger conceptual thinking. Yes, for sure. Yeah. But most of those will send those out to be made and not be making them themselves. So that's the other piece I think that I'm still. I mean, obviously, the problem with me making it myself is that it is a less perfect solution. But for me, I really like that more handmade, that less perfect solution, and it's sort of an antithetical sort of mode of operation to the current kind of the historically last 50, 60, 100 years of production where you're sending out, you're fabricating your sculptural work, you're not making it yourself. So I'm sort of working against that deliberately. And maybe it's because I am, a control freak, which is possible, that I want the feel of the process to be part of the solutions to the form, right? Because I'm altering the work as I make it, as much as I sort of have a basic plan when I start sewing the work. But I don't make maquettes or models or anything. I go from sketches and sort of shapes of pieces to sort of slamming them together. So there is a kind of innate addition and subtraction process, and a kind of a particular set of decisions that get made in the moment during the process that I can't describe that to somebody else necessarily. It's really hard to kind of translate that out into somebody else. I don't want to lose that sort of connection to the material itself. But it is a very old school way of working.
It is. But it's your way of working.
Right. But hopefully it ends up with a very dynamic kind of like something you've never seen before end point, even though it's...
For sure. Yeah. And I think if you're going to have that interplay between the painting and the sculpture, then you have to have that kind of push and pull between the two, and you have to have that process of wrestling it.
Exactly. And wrestling is a very good word too. Yes.
Well, in a few weeks' time, we will be wrestling.
Yes, you'll be wrestling it. And I'll be on Zoom saying, no, a bit that way. No, a bit that way.
We'll see how it goes.
I know, exactly.
But we're really looking forward to having it in the gallery, and for everyone to be able to come and see this.
No, I am too. I'm looking forward to seeing what it looks like. I did, though, I spent a long time making very detailed instructions for you. So that's another piece of the process of the puzzle in terms of, and that's something that I don't normally do, right? Is send the work out into the world by itself, as opposed to me mothering it and going with it.
Yeah.
But that requires then that I make a set of instructions, right, for you to help you guys figure out how to maneuver it, right? How to take care of it, how to install it. You know, so I think that's an interesting, for me, that's another layer of that sort of letting go of the work and pushing it, you know, pushing it out into the world, or that's an interesting piece of the puzzle too.
It is, and dictated by circumstance as well.
Right, but
you wouldn't be here in the UK at the moment.
Inflating
it in a gallery.
Exactly. But I think it's a good, I mean, I try and maintain a positive outlook and a way that again, like I talked about earlier, problems are just a different type of solution that you have to come up with. And so I really like that the fact that our hands were forced in this instance because of COVID actually allows a different layering of the communication or the existence of the work to come into being that I wouldn't have had to find a solution for otherwise. So I think, yes, it's not what we expected, but it's kind of an interesting way that we solved the puzzle.
Yeah.
At least hopefully we'll see in 2 weeks when we actually install.
I'm looking forward to it. We will look after it like a Tamagotchi.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Take care of it.
We will. Claire, Ashley, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. It's been
thank you for having me and letting me babble on for a while.
It's been a lot of fun, and we look forward to seeing the work in the gallery.
I know, me too. Thank you.
Thank you.